seminar, which is the last of our series for this term, and we'll resume at the start of May for a half term of seminars. We tend to go throughout May and then wind down in June. And I'll introduce David, our speaker, more fully, but I was about to give an introduction, but then Stephen just handed me this, which is a piece by Patrick Greenfield, the journalist in The Guardian, nominating his climate hero for this week. And he's nominated David, and he says, the former acting UN biodiversity chief is by no means the most famous David of the UK environmental world, but through his tireless commitment to multilateralism, knowledge of the UN processes and passion for life on Earth, he was a vital driving force during his time at the Convention on Biological Diversity, constantly pushing governments to make good on their promises. His replacement, Astrid Shoemaker, has very big boots to fill. So that's a pretty good way to introduce our speaker today. Just to add to that, David's been, we were just talking, David's been directly involved with the CBD since 1999, but also had earlier engagement in its development going all the way back to 1991. So in terms of a history of understanding the global architecture of biodiversity governance and where it's come from, his unparalleled knowledge and experience of that. And we're also fortunate that since he's retired from the UN, he's moved to Oxford, and he is a visiting fellow with us in the Leverhulme Centre for Nature Recovery. And so we see him around most weeks in the Oxford space. So also you do feel very welcome to engage with him and reach out to him about some of the things you hear today and beyond, and hopefully he'll be with us for many more years to come. So with that, thank you, David, and over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Yavinder, and thanks to all of you for coming this afternoon. It's particularly nice to see some old friends here, Sandra Diaz, another visiting fellow here, but of course, former co-chair of the IPBES Global Assessment. Michael, where's Michael? He was here a little while ago. Anyway, and some friends, Tony and others from the CBD Secretariat as well. Yeah, have been involved with the CBD for a very long time, starting in 1991 when I was working for an NGO and attending some of the negotiating sessions, and then joining the Secretariat in 1999. So been to most of the COPs, not all 16, but a few climate COPs as well. Now, does this work? How does... Okay. So Yavinder was, I think, at his first biodiversity COP in Cali, the most recent meeting of the Conference of the Parties. And if I understand from his blog, he thought this was the good COP compared to the other set of COPs under the climate convention. I'm going to talk a little bit later about some of the specific outputs of COP-16, but just to who has been to one of the climate COPs or biodiversity COPs? Okay, so quite a few of you. So you know that it is indeed a space for negotiation, and that's primarily, obviously, between governments. But it's also a space for sharing of information, showcasing implementation, for networking. And aside from what's happening in the official area, what's called the blue zone, in recent COPs, there's also been a lot of activities organized by the host country. You can see here the Zona Verde, the green zone. In Colombia, the president of the COP, who you can see in the top right of the screen there, Susana Mohammed, she was determined that this would be the COP de la Gente, the People's COP, and indeed there was a very large participation from civil society as well. So just in terms of who's engaged in a COP, it's of course, yeah, governments from the north and south, but a strong participation, a very important one, which I'll discuss a bit later, from civil society, including indigenous peoples, local communities, women, youth, and other civil society organizations. And I think the CPD process has benefited from being relatively open to this sort of participation. The little graphic on the left of the screen there just gives you a picture of the relative size of participation of these different groups in the last COP, in COP-16, which was in fact the largest, with about actually it says 1,300, it should be 13,000 participants. Still much smaller than the climate COPs, but much larger than previously. So this was COP-16. Yeah, so there was been these meetings of the Conference of the Parties since 1994, after the convention was first adopted. I'll look just very quickly also at the previous one, COP15, which was in Montreal. It should have been held in Kunming, China, but because of the pandemic was moved to Montreal, or at least the second part of it. And this meeting was important because it adopted the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which I think many of you will have heard of. I'm going to give a brief introduction, brief overview of that in a few minutes. So all of this is happening under the auspices of the Convention on Biological Diversity, which was adopted at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, alongside the maybe better known sister, the Climate Convention. Like the Climate Convention, it's primarily a framework convention. It provides a number of obligations on parties. Most of those are not legally enforceable, except for the reporting requirements, but it provides policy guidance to countries. And it also sets up some institutional arrangements. And of course, the key one is the COP among there, which meets now every 2 years, bringing together, as we've seen, those governments, but also civil society, science community, and other actors. Those institutional arrangements also include other things, and I won't go into the details of that, but a number of so-called subsidiary bodies, including a scientific subsidiary body, and of course, a secretariat. And so what is this biodiversity governance? And we can think of it, if you like, as the convention in its text, and then in the decisions made by the Conference of the Parties in providing policy guidance and also developing some mechanisms to support implementation of that guidance by countries. But the action is really at the country level. It's not a regulatory convention. It's not setting regulations in the way, say, CITES does, the Convention on International Trade and Endangered Species. It's really setting a normative framework, including, as we'll see, increasingly targets for implementation at the national level. And the primary vehicle there are these so-called national biodiversity strategies and action plans. And then, of course, implementation is important to be by all actors in those countries. Now, to be effective, though, that implementation needs to be kept under review. And indeed, this is supposed to be the primary role of the Conference of the Parties. And I think finally, as we'll see later, this role has been built up so that implementation can be monitored. Countries report on that implementation, and the Conference of the Parties can then say, okay, how are we doing against this guidance we've set? What adjustments need to be made? So it's that sort of loop there that I'm describing when if you like, in this term, biodiversity governance. And we're talking with a focus on the Convention on Biological Diversity, but of course there are a whole number of other biodiversity related conventions, CITES, the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, the Convention on Migratory Species, and others. There are other conventions that are also relevant, and we won't go into the details there. We've also seen these issues in recent years also now mainstreamed and integrated across the UN system through the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals. So putting all that together, this is the sort of picture that we have, if you like, of given an overview of what I mean by this global biodiversity governance, with now this Kunming-Montreal global biodiversity framework, pretty much as the center of something that's trying to bring all the actors together to provide a global framework that's relevant, not only for the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, but for all of the other instruments as well. So that was quite a long introduction. I'm now going to talk a little bit to give you an overview for those that are less familiar with the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, then look back at some of the evolution that's taken place under the convention in the past, and then look at the role of science in developing the global biodiversity framework and the general evolution of the convention, and then finally come back at the end and look at some of the next steps. What's next? So this Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, it's represented by this logo with the representing the 23 targets. So each of these little, whatever they are, these little shapes represents one of the 23 targets for 2030 that were negotiated and are part of that framework. And this logo is meant to emphasize that this really needs to be looked at as a whole. There's a tendency sometimes to focus on a particular target, target 3, the 30 by 30 target, but really we should be looking at the whole framework. So what is in this framework? Firstly, it's multi-scalar, both in time and in space. And so if we're looking in the longer term, the parties have said, they actually established this back in 2010, a long-term vision that we should be living in harmony with nature. So this is a long-term vision for 2050. It was negotiated at COP-10 in Nagoya and remains. What the Global Biodiversity Framework does, though, is try and say, what do we mean by that vision? Can we be a little bit more specific than saying just we want to live in harmony with nature? And so there are 4 goals. So these are long-term goals for 2050. And the first one, which we summarize as protect and restore nature, is the one that's focusing on the components of biodiversity itself. And it does include some quantitative elements. And we had a lot of discussion, and the parties had a lot of discussion. And Sandra, among others, heavily contributed to that discussion. And I think it'd be interesting to hear what you think, but I think that what we see here in looking at what we want to achieve across these different dimensions of biodiversity really is probably the most ambitious we could be that is still consistent with the science. It is an incredibly ambitious goal. The second goal, which we summarize as prosper with nature, it has 2 sort of angles to it. One is emphasizing sustainable use. So we should be making use of biodiversity. It's not only about conserving, and people should benefit from it. And in particular, this idea of nature's contributions to people, a concept championed again by Sandra, but being the focus of IPBES, in Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the IPCC for biodiversity, if you like. This concept about all the different benefits that people get from nature, including material ones, of course, like food, clean water, but regulating ones and cultural ones as well. This is a concept that evolved from the earlier concept of ecosystem services. So this is the second big goal of the plan. The third is focused on, really relates to the third objective of the CBD itself, which is about fair and equitable sharing of benefits derived from genetic resources, and now also from digitized genetic resources. That the idea being that these are resources maintained by communities and countries, predominantly in the South, and benefits should be the benefits generated, for example, from pharmaceutical companies and the like, should be shared. And finally, a goal about the means of implementation, mobilizing the necessary financial resources, providing the capacity, and specifically closing this biodiversity finance gap, and again, a quantitative element to that target. So these are the four overarching goals for 2050. But 2050 is a long way off. We need action now, and therefore the mission, complementing the longer term vision, the mission of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework is to take urgent action to halt and reverse biodiversity loss and put nature on a path to recovery by 2030. The full text actually goes on a bit, but that's the main gist of this vision. And it's these 23 targets. If we break that globe up into its little pieces, you'll see that we have those 23 action targets to achieve results by 2030. So these are not targets, to start action by 2030. You start action now to achieve the results by 2030. And some initial analysis that has been done to sort of modeling by the Netherlands PBL, modeling at least some of those targets and saying if they were fully implemented, would you actually achieve those goals? Well, you did achieve some elements of them. So there is some coherence in that plan. So we don't have time to go through all 23 targets. I'll highlight just these four just to give you an idea of the scope of them. So I mentioned earlier this green one, number 3, so-called 30 by 30 target is the one that everyone's heard of, I think, to conserve 30% of lands, waters and seas by 2030 through protected areas or through indigenous recognition of indigenous territories or other means. But this shouldn't just be any old 30%, right? It should be the areas that are important for biodiversity, the areas that are important for ecosystem services, and of course they must be effectively done and respecting the full rights of indigenous peoples. So there are a set of targets. The yellow one here, number 7, is an example that are addressing some of the direct drivers of biodiversity loss, such as pollution. We'll look at how this text, number 7, was negotiated in a minute. But there's also targets that focus on looking at some of the underlying drivers and what needs to be done, for example, by business to reduce negative impacts. And then there are other really important targets. So this one, 22, is about ensuring inclusive participation by all social groups, respecting rights, including access to justice. It also specifically in the full text mentions human rights defenders of the environment. So there are 23 targets, but this is just to give you an idea of the variation of some of them. So those targets then there in the middle. Another important part of this framework, which is less well known, but are these so-called I'd like to think of something more interesting than this name of cross-cutting considerations, but some of these general themes and principles, and there's a number of them. I'll highlight just a few here. But the framework has a very strong emphasis on rights, a human rights-based approach. It also recognizes the right for healthy and safe environment. It recognizes the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. And it cross-references, in fact, UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's the only other instrument that's mentioned in the plan, and only other legal instrument. It recognizes different value systems. It has a strong focus also on gender and gender responsiveness, as well as on intergenerational equity. And, you know, all of this perhaps can be summed up by this whole of government and whole of society approach. So whole of government, you need to look at, for example, all ministries, you need to look at all sectors of the economy, and all of society needs to be engaged in the actions if they're going to be successful. And finally, this plan has these different mechanisms to support implementation, to mobilize resources, to other implementation support, and the monitoring, reporting, and review, which we'll look at a little bit more later. So that's the plan as a whole, and there's been quite a few papers in the scientific literature written about this plans. These are some of the earlier ones, really highlighting some aspects of it. For example, it's the emphasis it places on the contribution of Indigenous peoples, the fact that it could be a framework that could achieve or support transformative change, which a theme which we'll come back to later. So that's just an overview of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. I'll now turn to look perhaps at how we got to where we are now with this framework, the evolution of the convention, and the role of science. So just coming back, showing the sequence of meetings of the COP that we've had since 1994. And I was looking at some of the topics, some of the key agenda items that that we saw perhaps in each of these sort of, we could say, roughly 3 phases of the convention. So, you know, early on, as in the top left-hand corner there, there's a lot of focus on looking at the different biomes and the biodiversity, how you'd manage biodiversity in different biomes. There was also an early focus on biosafety, access and benefit sharing, some of these other things like technology transfer. Early on, this concept of the ecosystem approach, and including the importance of adaptive management. Of course, looking at all 3 objectives of the convention, sustainable use and access and benefit sharing, an initial focus perhaps on protected areas in a more conventional sense. And then we've seen other issues be discussed over time. So complementing protected areas, other effective area-based management, the importance of safeguards in actions, for example, in actions on climate change, safeguards to protect the rights of Indigenous peoples, some emerging issues that have been looked at, like geoengineering and biofuels and what this means for biodiversity, increasing focus on looking at some of the underlying drivers, sustainable production and consumption, the concept of ecosystem services, which came from the Millennium Assessment, issues around biodiversity and health, that have come up. And then, more recently, we're seeing a whole range of other issues as well. Bigger focus on the rights-based approaches, complementing conservation strategies such as protected areas with recognition of indigenous territories, this concept of nature's contributions to people that I mentioned before, and so on. So we've seen a general movement, I would say, from really a more sort of what you could call a more conservationist approach, looking more and more at mainstream, looking at the direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity loss. And perhaps some of the key concepts that have emerged on this over this time are listed here. So I mentioned the ecosystem approach, which was something that was identified very early, looking at different principles of ecosystem management, and the idea of ecosystem services and its evolution as nature's contributions to people, balancing different ideas about the values of biodiversity. So from the intrinsic, we conserve biodiversity because we love biodiversity. There was a shift early on, correlated with the emergence of the idea of ecosystem services to a much more instrumental focus. So looking at the benefits, almost with an economic lens, that these that the services and biodiversity provides to people, and that now complemented also by this third dimension of looking at the relational aspects of biodiversity in people, with not people as part of nature, informed very much by indigenous worldviews as well. And so, yeah, I think we've seen a strong role of science, but also of traditional knowledge. And as we've gone forward in this time, we've had more and more focus on the drivers of biodiversity loss and addressing the drivers of biodiversity loss more directly. The direct drivers, the obvious ones: land use change, climate change, pollution, invasive alien species, and overuse of species and other aspects of biodiversity. But now also looking at the underlying drivers of biodiversity loss and the sectors behind them. There's been an evolution on the use of outcome-oriented targets. So this started really with a COP-16 with the Global Strategy for Plant Conservation. It became integrated into the General Strategic Plan. It was highlighted very much at COP-10 for the Aichi biodiversity targets, and now, of course, in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And matching that and following that has been an attempt to have a more consistent use of indicators so that you can have more robust monitoring. And there's also been increased awareness, I think, among the parties of the value of scenarios and models. And we'll give some examples of that in a moment. So I mentioned early on the importance of Indigenous peoples and local communities to the role of the convention. And indeed, I think Indigenous peoples and local communities have played really a very strong role in shaping the convention and also the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And I think this happens initially, of course, because embedded in the text of the convention itself is an article of the convention on the top left of the screen here, which calls upon parties to the convention to respect, preserve, and maintain the knowledge, innovations, and practice of then the terminology was Indigenous and local communities. And soon on, COP3 already Tony was the secretary of the meeting that established the decision was made to establish a dedicated working group. So that means a group of all the parties, all the member states of the convention, with enhanced mechanisms of participation of Indigenous peoples and to focus on these issues. So that was established in 1996. I think its first meeting was in Seville in 2000. And it developed a whole program of work on this area, which, among other things, generated a whole set of guidelines on protecting the rights of Indigenous peoples and rights over their traditional knowledge and over their territories and sacred sites and the like. And these have been quite important part, I think, of international law. At the same time, of course, there's been evolution outside the convention on this area in the UN with the development of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which has got now fairly close, well, increasingly close to universal support. There is the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues of the that meets in New York, that has called upon further strengthening of work on this issue under the convention. And the second global assessment of IPBES and the whole IPBES process has also engaged more with traditional knowledge, linking science with traditional knowledge owners, recognize the contribution of Indigenous peoples to conservation, that the fact that biodiversity in lands managed or in the territorial in the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples is, generally speaking, in a much better shape than biodiversity in other areas. So the role of Indigenous peoples as actors in protecting and using sustainable biodiversity has become more and more recognized. And this, I think, is very much reflected in the GBF, in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And it was evident, I think, at COP-15 in Montreal, that this was much more broadly recognized than previously. And in fact, then in the last COP-16, in Cali, the governments agreed to formalize this working group, which had met on an ad hoc basis, into a permanent subsidiary body with further likely with further in rights for participation of Indigenous peoples and local communities. So that was established last October, and it will now have its first meeting in October this year. So Indigenous peoples and local communities, an important role. But of course, many other groups, what the UN calls major groups, are also play an important role. We've seen an increased role of business and finance organizations over the years, seen an increased role of subnational entities, including cities, in fact, in the development of a whole plan on that, and of course of the scientific community, which I'll focus in on in a moment. And of course, all of these groups, and with the Secretariat and the media, all play their role in this multilateral process, right? So here in the center, the three pictures in the center here, if you like, is sort of views of the formal negotiations, right? In the big plenary halls in the middle, but then also in these sort of more intense contact groups where, yeah, the negotiators are in more direct hand-to-hand combat over the text. and in very informal groups as well in terms of resolving that text. And so it's definitely the governments that are at the center of this process. The role of COP presidents and of their teams, and working with the Secretariat and working with other leaders in the from among the parties and others, is also really important. So at the top there, you see the presidents of COP 14, 15, and 16, respectively: Yasmin Fouad from Egypt, Huang Guangzhou from China, and Susanna Muhammad from Colombia. They all played very proactive roles in getting agreement at these meetings. But then, you know, everyone else, the so-called observers, also play an important role, as do individual delegates, in providing information, in trying to improve the quality of the texts that are there, in the case of Indigenous peoples, women's groups and others, in defending their rights and advocating for the sort of changes that they think are needed. So this is, this sums up, if you like, this multilateral process, which I find quite amazing, that you know, through this sort of process you can get thousands, or 10,000, well, some governments maybe 3,000 delegates from 180 or so countries that are present. Usually there's 180, 181, and 182 countries of the 196 possible members present, to actually agree everything by consensus. Well, maybe we can talk a little bit later how that happens. But focusing a little bit now on the science side and the inputs that scientists can make and do make. So this sort of summarizes maybe the sort of flow. So the decisions are made by COP, the Conference of the Parties, those big meetings of around 10,000 people. But they're very much prepared by the smaller subsidiary bodies, still with all the countries involved and most of the stakeholder groups also involved. But these are meetings of maybe around 1,000 people. So this is SUBSTA, the subsidiary body on scientific, technical, and technological advice. And it's a much maligned body. Everyone says, oh, this is just a little COP and it's just a pre-COP and so on. But in fact, a lot of important decisions, guidance, indicators have been processed through this body. And in turn, that draws upon inputs from the scientific community, and they may come from studies, some of which may be commissioned, others which may be just produced, from expert groups, including, again, those that are established specifically by the previous COP. And since its establishment, IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, otherwise known as the IPCC for biodiversity. So all of these channel important inputs. Now, I think sometimes scientists can turn up at a COP and be disappointed that they can't get their great ideas or their latest research reflected in the decisions. And they can have an influence, and they do have an influence, and they certainly did have an influence, particularly, I think, at COP-15. But it's generally too late to get new stuff into this process at the COP. You've got to start at this end. And so there's a lag there. Of course, some of the things that you may be discussing in a COP, in a side event, or in a discussion, or in a panel, may then spark some interest and feed through this process and be taken up at a later COP. But this is one thing to bear in mind. Now, has science made an impact on the CBD? I mean, I think, probably I am biased, but I think very much so. I think the convention has been a science-based convention. The Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework itself, this is, the text from the text of it. It seeks to respond to essentially the challenges set out in the IPBES global assessment and in the convention's own global biodiversity outlook, which contains an analysis of the progress towards the previous strategic plan, the Aichi targets. And, a lot of the elements of that global assessment inform then the structure of the GBF, the fact that you need to look at the direct drivers, the underlying drivers, the fact that you need to look at these multiple values, legitimized consideration of these multiple values. The categorization of direct drivers was used directly. So there was a lot of material that finds its way in the Global Biodiversity Framework because I think of the IPBES global assessment, because in the IPBES process, like in the IPCC process, it's developed by scientists, but then the summary is endorsed by governments, by policymakers. So if it's in there, then it's much easier then to use that in the negotiations. But if we take a step step back, I think we see also this whole idea of halting and reversing and putting nature on a path to recovery, bending the curve. This very much came from the scientific community, of course, working, I think, closely with the conservation NGOs. So this paper by the late Georgina Mace and colleagues in Nature Sustainability sort of set the challenge of can we bend the curve as sort of idealized in this colored multiple graphs here, which was produced, I think, by WWF. And then Michael and other colleagues developed this paper, Bending the Curve of Terrestrial Biodiversity. These are some results from that paper, which were then reproduced in the Global Biodiversity Outlook, demonstrating the feasibility of bending the curve, but also of the challenges of that and the fact that you needed an integrated approach. So it wasn't enough just to invest in the traditional conservation actions. So that you do that and you do it with high ambition and you do it well, it will take you from the red lines to the blue lines, but not enough really to bend the curve. To do that, you need to be working with agriculture, you need to be addressing climate change, you need to be working with all the sectors. And so this very much, I think, influenced the understanding of what is possible, what represents high ambition, and then what it means in what in the breadth of the actions that would be needed to do that. And that work, of course, builds on work over decades of work on looking at trying to monitor progress for the earlier strategic plan, that was the Aichi targets, and earlier work on scenarios. I mentioned earlier this one target 7. And I thought it might be just fun to look at the evolution of the text of this target. So there was a zero order draft, then there was a first order draft. So there was a zero order draft produced in early 2019, and then on the basis of that, there were comments made in writing from parties and from observers, and then there was a first draft produced. There were then a series of 5 meetings of this working group. The last one that took place well ahead of COP-15 was this working group 4. It met again then just before, in Montreal, just before the COP-15, and then we had the final adopted text. So you can see what was in the first draft, what was in the final text, and then what happened in the meantime when negotiators, through a mix, I think, of enthusiasm and caution and all sorts of things, put in a lot of alternatives. Some of this was because they were concerned about particular issues. So what impact would reducing pesticide use or reducing fertilizer use have on agriculture? How feasible would it be to address some of these things? But on the other hand, some of these multiple texts just came because every delegation, often advised by their own scientists, thought they had a better word in than the next one. And there was perhaps some lack of discipline, maybe, among some of those delegations, sometimes in trying to say, okay, we can, yes, we'd prefer this, but this is fine. Of course, eventually we came to a text. But the very final text was prepared by the COP president with the support of the Secretariat. Just to note some of the changes that happened here. So one of the changes was with relation to pesticides, was a focus on risk rather than quantity. And this was actually one of the recommendations from this science brief that a group of scientists, mostly scientists that have been involved in the IPBES process, produced. They produced these on a number of targets, and they gave the scientific evidence for for the level of ambition and for how some of these targets could be achieved. And I think this was perhaps an example of where scientific input just before and in the moment actually, unusually, because usually it has to come much earlier in the process, as I mentioned, actually made a difference. Just zooming in on some of those changes. Again, I've repeated the first text, and here is the last text compared to the last negotiated text before the presidency took it over and made the last changes. And actually, you can see most of the changes in the end were deleting some detail or some issues that were really cross-cutting issues, and trying to simplify the text a bit, although we still see it's much longer than the original. Yeah, so that's just one example of how a text was negotiated and how the scientific community made inputs. And in fact, a paper looking at the lessons from COP-15 came with this conclusion here, that scientists can strengthen the effectiveness of these agreements if they do a number of things, which is prioritizing communication, consensus building, networking, and actually getting the support often of other groups. So this graphic here is a more complicated version of the one I showed at the beginning of this section with the blue circles of input, substat, and COP. It's basically the same thing. We also had a dedicated working group for the negotiations, but this also looks at how NGOs, the media, and others can also interact in this process. Okay, I better move on. So now just looking very quickly at some of the future issues. So again, we're looking at how can we implement this framework. Just to repeat this slide again, we're really going to be looking at what happens with implementation and then the review of that implementation, which is due to take place at the next COP-17 in Armenia in October or so 2026. So that's just to recap that. These are some of the key outcomes from COP-16. There were many others on biodiversity and health, on biodiversity and climate change, on identifying special places in the marine environment that might need protection under the new treaty on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. But these are some of the perhaps key issues in terms of looking at this biodiversity governance. I mentioned this purple one I mentioned already, this new subsidiary body and program of work on Indigenous peoples. There was also an agreement to establish a fund for benefit sharing from the use of digital sequence information. So we'll see how that gets mobilized, but companies or entities that make use of digital sequence information, that's genetic resources that have been digitized, stored in these global databases, should share a proportion of their profits or turnover with a fund which would support communities and countries in the south, indigenous peoples in the north and south, countries in the south. There were then these last 3 or 4 things here: the monitoring framework, the reporting and review process, the strategy for resource mobilization, and the guidance to the Global Environment Facility, which is the current financial mechanism of the convention. It wasn't possible for them to complete all these decisions in Cali because we ran out of time, and so there was a resume meeting a couple of weeks ago in Rome, where finally they did come to agreement on these, and particularly on the strategy for resource mobilization, which allowed then agreement also on the monitoring framework. So we have now a good framework, relatively good framework for monitoring progress, with a whole set of indicators, which includes a subset that all countries have been asked to use, the so-called headline indicators. Countries are now in the process of setting national targets, and most countries have already done that. This slide will look a lot better when we get the English translation of the Brazilian targets, which have been adopted and agreed, but not yet formally transmitted, so they're not showing in this slide. Yeah, countries have set national targets. Some of them align very closely with the global biodiversity targets, others less so. We can talk about that later if there's time. And they're also updating their national biodiversity strategies and action plans, which is their plan for how to get to implement those targets. And these are just some examples of that. I just put in this slide really to link to the talk that was a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, by Andy Gonzalez, presenting the proposals for a monitoring network through GeoBon. But this sort of complete system, if you like, it's less well developed for biodiversity than for for climate change, where you have a well-developed global climate observing system. Of course, we didn't used to have IPBES, but now we do, so that sort of matches the role of IPCC. The research is also perhaps less cohesive than it is in the climate community. Future Earth was meant to fill that gap, but perhaps less successfully than we'd hoped for. The next COP, as I say, COP-17, will be looking at assessing where we are. So looking at, and hopefully we'll have some scientific work which will model what would happen, what a baseline scenario without action would be, what we would get if we implement these national targets and the national NBSAPs, which are analogous, if you like, to the NDCs under the Climate Convention, and then what is actually where would we get, which would probably be less than that if we really scrutinize the actions that have been put in place to address those national targets, and then of course compare that with what is needed for the full implementation of the GBF to identify this sort of gap. So that's what will be coming up at COP-17. There's a lot that the scientific community can do to contribute to that. And then finally, I just want to mention one of the two most recent IPBES assessments, the IPBES assessment on the underlying causes of biodiversity loss and transformative change, because I think it points to some of the discussions, perhaps some of the difficult discussions that are going to have to take place in the future. So I think this was really quite a groundbreaking assessment. It brought together a larger participation, I think, of social scientists. I mean, the global assessment already did, but there was a whole larger number and more species of social scientists involved in the transformative change assessment than others. And it started looking at some of these really difficult issues at the underlying causes of biodiversity loss. So it identifies these three areas, right? Disconnection from and domination over nature and people, linked to colonialism, the concentration of wealth and power. We've seen quite a few displays of that in recent weeks, I think, and the prioritization of short-term individual and material gains. So the need to look much more on consumption. And it identifies, among other things, a number of strategies, some of which, I think the GBF is beginning to do some of these to varying degrees. So particularly looking at number one and some aspects of number two, and perhaps beginning to address, but it probably would need to really step up efforts on 3, 4, and 5 in particular. So that's it. I mean, just summing up, I just have these 4 words. I think we have seen, I think, some successful approaches of multilateralism. And it's necessary. It's not sufficient to deliver the changes we need to see, but it can help do that. The broad participation of different sectors of society, of all sectors of society, is paramount if we're going to be successful. Science must play a strong role, and I think there'll be further calls on the scientific community to provide analysis to help implementation move forward. And finally, it's really important that there's a clear vision and a determination to focus on an outcome. And so that's, in a sense, That's in the essence of these global targets and goals, but also I think the determination of those involved in the process to get towards a result. So thank you. I should have also thanked my colleagues that I've worked with over many years in the CBD Secretariat, in the scientific community, and indeed among many other communities globally. Happy for questions.
David? Okay, we'll open up to questions, then we have some drinks around the corner as well for more informal conversation. I'd like to just follow up on your thing about the contribution of science. So how could we, as academics, contribute? So one route would be through the IPBES and the EOS assessment. What would you think are the most effective way for people to engage in different ways in that scientific, or just in wider research process, not just science, but beyond that?
Yeah. So I think that's quite a big question, and I think there is many different ways. So one, since you mentioned it, the IPBES process, and the second global assessment will start shortly, and IPBES is currently looking for experts to be involved in that process. So maybe we'll circulate the links to that. The deadline is the end of this month, well, March the 28th, for the first phase of that process. But then I think, secondly, there's a lot that's going to be needed to try and support this review process. So, you know, what can we translate, on the one hand, the commitments, and on the other hand, the actions that countries are taking? Can we model those and say, are we, you know, what progress towards the targets, what progress towards the goals will we make with that? I think improving the work on the models would be a big help in that too. I think sort of a more general point is that it's the policymakers, and perhaps especially, well, everywhere, I think, but including those in the South, they want to rely on data that they can trust. And that doesn't mean that it's just sort of data that's published in a paper globally. They have to understand where it's coming from, and ideally, you know, have their own people engaged in that. So I think collaboration with, across countries, particularly with developing countries and with communities in those countries, the scientific community, but others, is really important if we're going to make the science not only, you know, objectively good, well, also to make it objectively good, because we know that without that sort of ground truth in, then it may not be. So I think that's a very strong point. And then of course, supporting what's happening here at home. So supporting local monitoring efforts as well. And then I think using science in terms of messaging to the public through the media, to friends and so on, in terms of the challenges and what is needed.
Okay, great, thank you. We can open up the floor. Sandra?
Thank you. Thank you, David. Is it working? Cycle after cycle, when the global biodiversity outlooks are published, and there is cycle as a cycle, the conclusion that the vast majority of the targets have not been made, people may ask, if you keep failing achieving the targets, why keep trying? And what's the point in following with the process?
Yeah, so I mean, I would contest that that countries are failing. Some are, but many, I think, are making a lot of progress. The progress isn't enough to meet the targets. One could say the goals and the targets are therefore too ambitious. I wouldn't say that, because they are what I think we know we need to achieve if we're going to have a livable planet. And I think it's very much similar to the story with climate change, right? Where without the actions, without the actions that have been taken under the climate convention, we would have been on track for 4 degrees. We're now on track for roughly 3 degrees. We need to be on track for less than 2 degrees, and we know that actually even that is very harmful. I think it's similar for biodiversity. We have made progress, so we didn't fully meet any of the targets, and I think it was important that there was an honest assessment last time of the progress that was made and not made. But there was, some progress made, and I think it's important then to look at where progress was made, and learn from that. And I think a couple of lessons, spring to mind there. So one is coming back to this target 3 and this 30 by 30. Actually, the targets last time were 17 by 20, and we got very close to that. We got, around 16% protected areas on land. The other target for marine areas last time was 10 by 20, in other words, 10% of marine areas. And for areas within countries' jurisdiction, they surpassed that target on paper. And I believe we could quite easily meet the 30% target. But if you don't truly meet that target, and that means by focusing on areas that are important for biodiversity, important for ecosystem services, engage indigenous peoples and others in their management and manage them effectively. If you don't do all those things, then actually it shouldn't count. And I think in our messaging on the 30 by 30 target, we need to be very, very clear. Otherwise, we'll repeat the same mistake, that we'll meet the headline, but not actually protect a lot of biodiversity that way. The other sort of lesson I would have is, looking at the policies to reduce deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon. And you can see quite clearly that if you put policies in place, as the first Lula government did, then you have massive reductions in deforestation. When you stop implementing those policies or implement opposite policies, then you get reversal. And when you implement those policies again, you get progress. So, if you do take the actions, it works. And I think that has to be the key message, that, hopefully the scientific community can help to demonstrate as well.
Thank you. You gave a great exposition of the development of the CBD process, and it seems that the new GBF has learnt a lot of the lessons of what went wrong during previous cycles. But the other big difference now, of course, is that the decade that we're monitoring now is a lot shorter than the previous ones, because we lost the first 2 years to COVID. So thinking ahead to when we get to 2030, what do you see being, how do you see the GBF being reviewed and repurposed, and how does that discussion start? And what can we look forward to? What signals should we be searching for?
So, like to think that not too much would have to be changed to the basic structure and content of the framework. Already it includes this 2050 vision and 2050 goals. Obviously, the targets for 2030 would need to be updated and hopefully stepped up in ambition to get closer to those 2050 goals. But I think, yeah, and that would need to be informed about, what we learn in the meantime and what is done and the progress that is made in the meantime. I mentioned that I think you'd have to put even more weight on some of those underlying drivers than is in the current plan, and that's the best assessment would suggest that. But I would hope also that the world isn't distracted by thinking about what the next iteration is rather than doubling down and trying to implement what we have. It's, and I think my biggest criticism of the process is that, yeah, sometimes the meetings are basically full of negotiation junkies, so they want to negotiate the next thing. And we need more emphasis on implementing what's already been agreed.
Yeah, I was just wondering.
Sorry, it's just.
Thank you. I was wondering, based on your experience having gone through the negotiation process many times, what is your thought process or thinking when you decide whether to concede on a point versus reach a point of compromise versus really advocate for your stance or the stance of your delegation? What is your kind of thought process there?
Right. So, I mean, I did attend COP-16.2, the recent meeting in at the end of February as part of the UK delegation. But of course, most of my time I've been in the Secretariat, so I haven't, had a point. We, of course, are impartial, but in a sense not neutral, because I think we've got we're trying to support the implementation of the convention. So when we were supporting the COP-15 president, the Chinese presidency in Montreal for COP-15 on preparing that final text, for instance, there was a real effort to maximize the ambition consistent with the science, and some delegations wanted high ambition in some areas, others wanted high ambition in other areas, and maybe you saw this as a bit of a trade-off. And so we basically, and the presidency basically developed a text which was high ambition on both sides, and trying to think what is the ambition that could be agreed. And it's interesting because if you'd asked one side or the other, would you accept this or would you accept that, probably they wouldn't have done individually, but when it was a package, they did. And I think so. Yeah, sometimes this is my last point on the sort of this vision and this determination. I think you need to be very clear on what is this trying to achieve. So yes, you're trying to achieve agreement, but you're also trying to achieve an agreement that is meeting the stated needs of what you're trying to negotiate.
Thank you, David. I'm really pleased you put that last slide up on the sort of transformational scenario slide, and I've got three questions that sort of come out from that. One, do you believe there's any chance of meeting our goals unless we take this particular report and the findings of this report seriously? Two, how can we as a community and the CBD perhaps and others actually communicate better? Because I think this is the most important report IPBES has done from my perspective that nobody's ever heard of. And three, what are governments actually doing to take any of the recommendations this report seriously, to give us any sense that that we may be actually getting to some of the root causes?
Yeah, so those are really good questions, and I agree with your middle point there that this is perhaps the most important report that no one's ever heard of. And coming back to Vinda's first question about what can the scientific community do, I think one of the things is try and translate, promote, dissect, work on this report and in terms of what it might mean. I think it's a very significant assessment. It's perhaps less tangible than some of the others in terms of what can be done. And so I think more work by the academic community to promote understanding of what this means. The earlier drafts of this assessment were even more stark and perhaps would have been politically unpalatable. This report in the end was approved, right? It was negotiated line by line. The summary for policymakers was discussed line by line and was approved by the members of IPBES, which is most countries. Now, I think the fact that governments have signed up to a report with these conclusions is of itself newsworthy, yet there was almost no news about this. I discussed with one journalist of one prominent paper in this area, and she said, "Oh, we didn't think there was anything new in it." I mean, maybe this is obvious in a sense, but the fact that all the governments of the world have signed off on this report, I think, is pretty epic. And yeah, we need to work on it. Can we achieve the goals without this? I don't think so. Can we make progress towards the goals? Yes. Yeah, I think the report itself says basically we cannot have the transformative change that we need without addressing these issues.
Thank you so much for that comprehensive talk. And actually, just on this slide around the underlying causes, I do think it's quite huge that countries can sign up to recognize A, B, and C in itself. But at the same time, you mentioned earlier, there's a increase in business and financial institutions' participation, hence influence in these negotiation processes. And when we see outcomes like in Target 19, where we need to scale up finance, and it's private finance as well, blended finance, funds, bonds, swaps, all sort of new instruments coming online. Not all of those would guarantee that it doesn't exacerbate A, B, and C in terms of increasing wealth and power specifically. And I think that's an issue of us sometimes looking at diagnosing issues from a very transformative lens, but providing very piecemeal policy solutions. But do you think negotiation processes like the CBD would ever be able to agree consensus-based outcomes that would address underlying causes like this?
Well, I mean, firstly, the governments in IPBES have approved this report. So, well, translating that into the sort of more policy normative language of a convention would be an additional challenge. But I think that may be the sort of discussions that have to take place as we prepare for the update of the Global Biodiversity Framework in 2030. And to be in that position, I think certainly there needs to be a lot more discussion, right? yes, in the academic community, but I think ultimately by people, you know, there needs to be more socialization, I think, of these results.
Yeah, there's one more. We'll take two more here. Let's help you, and then we'll do.
Okay, thank you. I wonder if you would like to share more about the Kunming's, the GBF, about the indigenous knowledge recognition, and how does it emphasize with the to transform the tacit knowledge to the codified knowledge, and how they transform the knowledge production, dissemination, and circulation in this agenda. Thank you very much.
Yeah, not sure how well I can answer that question. I mean, I think the convention has helped to increase the recognition of the role of indigenous peoples in conservation and in sustainable use, and you know that's demonstrated by looking at outcomes in particular. And then I think the IPBES process has worked on looking at how traditional knowledge can be drawn upon, can be used in scientific assessments like the global assessment, alongside more conventional Western science. Yeah, I'm not really an expert in being able to go much more in that, but we could perhaps talk later and find people that could help you with that.
Okay, we'll take just two more at the end. So just Francia.
Hello, David. So my question is, given that I would say national priorities are shifting, and the sources and the funding that would normally go towards biodiversity is being quite significantly impacted, especially in recent months, and I think it seems that it will be the case for the foreseeable future. How do you see bodies such as the CBD navigating this new landscape?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't really have a good answer. I think, I mean, part of the reason that there was a successful result in Rome a couple of weeks ago was that the delegates there wanted to demonstrate that even in this difficult geopolitical climate, multilateralism can still work, and we can still get an agreement. And there was an obvious not just willingness, or I think almost determination of most delegations there to find a result and find a way forward. So on the one hand, you know, that's good. On the other hand, perhaps, you know, in finding that way forward, they left a lot of questions in terms of resource mobilization unanswered, or to be answered over the next 2 and 4 years. And I think, you know, again, we just have to do whatever work we can to provide the arguments, provide the evidence of why, you know, funding is needed, and how it may be raised. And and recognize, and I think the comment made earlier, that you know there isn't going to be a magic solution from private finance. So yeah, these are really challenging times. I think, yeah, we have to continue to make the case, and also, you know, look for what can be done through drawing upon all sorts of funding and mainstreaming actions. So progress can still be made, but it is more challenging.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks so much for the great talk. So some of the challenges that we've seen implementing the convention and kind of tackling perhaps all, the SDGs is that these issues are often seen and tackled in silos, right? And so we saw the other IPBES report, the Nexus assessment report is kind of encouraging us to tackle these issues more in tandem. And at COP-16.2 in Rome, there was a piece an agenda item that passed on cooperation. So I guess, and cooperation, it could be amongst the three Rio conventions, with the UNFCCC, the UNCBD, but also with other conventions such as CITES and the SDGs more broadly. And so I guess I was just curious to hear, maybe your thoughts on the cooperation item that passed, its importance, kind of maybe opportunities, challenges for this cooperation, also hopes for the future. Of course, what I've heard is that sometimes, maybe the secretariats would love to collaborate more, but it needs to be a party-driven process. So there are kind of some different challenges put forward by parties for reasons that they may not want to kind of link these processes too closely, and maybe obviously not in these words, but ends up keeping them a bit more siloed. So yeah, just interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that decision on cooperation was important. Also, the decisions that were taken already in Cali on biodiversity and climate change, which was quite an important step forward, and on, for instance, biodiversity and health, were important as well. I think I'm quite hopeful that the COP30 meeting in Belém will further strengthen these understanding on these linkages. And I think, it was perhaps with COP30 in Belém in mind that there was quite a good agreement on biodiversity and climate change in Cali. So, I mean, this is really about, I think, on the one hand, making sure that, well, obviously we need to be aware of the impacts of climate change on biodiversity in terms of biodiversity conservation, but also the contribution of nature-based solutions to both mitigation and adaptation. I think there's a lot to do on awareness raising, also more broadly on the importance of biodiversity for adaptation in particular. But at the same time, also, of course, guarding against investment in nature-based solutions. And maybe there's a problem with the word solution because it's not going to solve the whole problem. So that this doesn't detract from the importance of reducing emissions from fossil fuels at the same time. And then, of course, managing the difficult trade-offs around biofuels and things like that. But I think we are seeing increasing joint action, if you like, on climate and biodiversity. I think we need to see obviously a lot more in terms of the food sector. And then I think there has been a lot of advances, I think, in public understanding and of the importance of biodiversity for health lately, and that's also particularly useful.
Great. I'm going to have one final cheeky question. I'll keep it short. There's in the public, there's widespread cynicism about the convention process and the COP, so more towards the climate convention, which gets much more news, and you can always predict the news headlines after each COP and what's going to happen. If you took a time machine back to the 90s and were designing an architecture for conventions, what do you think were the lessons you've learned over these decades about how could this work better, perhaps make more progress, perhaps be more attractable to the public?
Yeah, I mean, would we have, negotiated 3 separate conventions on biodiversity, climate, and desertification? Certainly building in stronger linkages would make sense. On the other hand, given the breadth and the complexity of all of those, I could see that could also be challenging. So I think, I mean, the main lesson from the CBD side, I think, would be to have tried to maybe discourage the absolute volume of issues being negotiated and have a bit more focus on reviewing implementation, which is eventually come, right? And it's the same thing in the climate convention. So the big advances, I think, in the Paris Agreement were that, and now in the GBF, that you're going to be reviewing implementation, and perhaps it shouldn't have taken so long to get there. Yeah, I mean, but I mean, the other thing, and I think also coming back to the synergies or the silo issue, I mean, the problem then is really implementation, right, at the national level. So the agreements are not bad. It's the follow up and the implementation of them that has to improve.
Okay, great. I think we'll wrap up there. Do Cara, feel free to join us around the corner for an informal drink. And thank you very much, David, both for this talk, but also for your contribution over the decades to making all of this the reality that it is. So thank you very much.